Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. As you may know, people who pre-ordered the premium edition of Age of Mythology Retold just had some early access to a beta version for 3 days. It's officially coming out in 6 weeks on September 4th, but I want to share my thoughts about what I experienced playing it over the weekend. I won't bury the lead. The short summary of my review is, frankly, the game is really good. I went in with very little experience in Age of Mythology, but found it was pretty easy to pick up and hit the ground running. The game is in a very playable state, with time to address the issues that players highlighted over the weekend. And in this video, I'm going to break down a few categories to talk about, most of which are aspects I'd say the game is thriving. First off, just to jump into the numbers, the players in the beta over the weekend generally fluctuated between 1 to 2,000 at any given moment, with a peak almost hitting 3,000. These are only the players who pre-ordered the premium edition, and was more than enough to find games quickly, where I played 7 ranked 1v1 games, and I don't think I ever had to wait longer than 90 seconds while queuing. The first thing we'll talk about is just the gameplay experience and new quality of life changes. The game uses the AoE 3 Definitive Edition engine, and ran smoothly, at least on my setup, which to be fair is a pretty decent computer. The recommended specs are, from what I can tell, identical to AoE 4, and seems pretty well optimized even at this point, which is nice for especially lower end setups. Getting into the gameplay side, probably the most obvious change is god powers are now reusable. Each time there's a cooldown, and while they're free the first time to use, the second time they have a steep favor cost. So I doubt players are actually going to reuse them all that often, with the cost going up then each time you use them as well, making it even harder to justify. Personally, I love the idea though, and you always feel the need to save them up if you truly only ever have one use, even if practically speaking now, you only see them being used once. In my 7 ranked games, no one used a god power twice, just as an anecdote, as it never felt worth the favor. Of course, auto queue remains a part of the game at the town center, where you just right click create villager to make it auto queue, or just left click if you want to queue a specific number. New town centers also automatically produce villagers on auto queue when they're built, if you have that enabled, and you can also enable your starting town center to auto queue from the beginning of the game automatically in the options for added convenience. That said, an interesting choice is you can't auto queue military units in ranked, at least at the moment, and it's just something you can enable in single player or an unranked hosted game. I'm not sure I fully agree with that choice, and personally I think they should just embrace auto queue as a core part of the game, but that's something that will probably be up to community feedback. I really like that you can auto queue the next age now by right clicking it and locking in your minor god choice, where villager production will pause and you'll start to advance the moment you have the resources to. It just makes the game feel really smooth and frees up your attention elsewhere to make more interesting decisions. The remake then pushes the power scaling in a really interesting way. Just like before, you can create a Titan as your de facto final push, spending a huge number of resources and villager work time to create your almost unstoppable unit that can now walk across water. You then have a Wonder, which is a huge upfront investment in the final age, but gives you a trickle of favor, cuts god power reuse cost in half, gives your myth units and titans plus 50% attack and HP plus 15% speed, and lets you rebuild Titan gates to get a new Titan every 10 minutes. I've always thought Wonders should have a useful role in AoE 2, and it's a great idea that extends the late game and gives you a supercharged boost, even if in practice many Age of Mythology games don't often make it to the 4th age at all. A couple of other creative changes are markets are available in Age 2 instead of Age 3, letting you rebalance your economy more easily. They also added the Villager Center, which is like a town center in the 2nd age that can make villagers and be a drop-off point which can be placed anywhere on the map, like a TC in AoE 2 or 4. It's weaker than a regular town center, doesn't passively fire arrows, and doesn't increase pop limit, but you can feel them pushing the game a little more in the direction of AoE 2 or AoE 4. It doesn't help with the pop limit criticism of the game being very restrictive, and you still have a hard cap of generally 100 villagers you can make as well, but is maybe helpful for boomy sorts of players, and feels like a reasonable compromise to the usually very restrictive TC placement rules. Another aspect I think makes the game more friendly for AoE 2 and AoE 4 players is there's some really good hotkey customization, now with things like selecting all of a type of building, researching texts assigned to hotkeys, etc. Just those basic features that have been added to definitive editions. It took me about 20 minutes to go through and set up my hotkeys, but really made the game feel much easier to pick up and was time well spent. Next up, I won't go into too much depth, but we should talk about balance changes. Even with my limited knowledge of the game, it was very obvious every civ had their bonuses, unit costs, technology costs, etc. worked extensively. In fact, I'd say they did not shy away from that aspect at all. I couldn't find an official list of changes, and a Google search only brought up an unofficial list, but you can see it's pretty long. I don't think there's a point in going through all of the changes here, and there'll probably be a major balance patch a month or two once tens of thousands of games are played. But just to give one example, let's take Poseidon, who previously had 10% cheaper cavalry and 15% cheaper stables, giving them a great cavalry rush. Now that's replaced by cavalry moving faster and having half-price markets, remember coming one age earlier than usual, along with even better exchange rates. There's still a Russian cavalry aspect there, and they feel aggressive, but is an example of how they're tweaking the identity of civs in some pretty large ways. Next, for the multiplayer experience, really not too many complaints here. I played several ranked games and just had one crash with a particularly large battle after a great game where I used Earthquake, and I guess it was too much for the game or the other player's computer to handle. Outside of that, I can't point to any issues, which is pretty good for an early access beta. The game features an unranked lobby, a ranked matchmaking queue system, and an unranked quick match, very similar to AoE 2. Moving on to the campaign, it's a little hard to judge, as I never played the original one and only the first 5 missions were unlocked for the beta. So far, I really enjoyed this part as well, and played on hard difficulty, which is second only to Titan, and felt some pushback from the AI without ever getting frustrating or stressful. The AI will pressure you with raids, and you can't just throw your initial army at them and win. So there's a fun level of challenge, at least for me as a relatively inexperienced player of this game, but with an RTS background. The original Age of Mythology campaign is very well regarded. One criticism I've seen is the voice acting is not as good as the original, though it's hard to say how much nostalgia is wrapped up in that criticism. Here's an example of each, so you can judge for yourself.
You cannot ignore the omens, Arcantos. Lord Poseidon's displeasure is clear. We must help break the siege at Troy.
Troops we send now will be lucky to arrive before the fight is over. Even if they do, their only task will be to show the banner of Atlantis, not a task for an admiral.
You cannot ignore the omens, Arcantos. Lord Poseidon's displeasure is clear. We must help break the siege at Troy.
Troops we send now will be lucky to arrive before the fight is over. Even if they do, their only task will be to show the banner of Atlantis, not the task for an admiral.
Next up, let's talk a bit about the graphics. This is a very subjective topic, of course, but personally, I think they look great and are much better than anything previous while keeping units very recognizable, at least to me. I've seen commenters already saying they don't notice a difference from the older versions, but I think side by side, it's very obvious the game is way more modern looking. I also really like the ability to zoom way in and out, and being a 3D game, you can also rotate the camera, of course, as well. The UI feels very modern to me, and more in line with other Age of Empires games, though it would be nice to have a UI scaling option to make it smaller if you want, and also an option to make it transparent, like in previous versions. Under the Accessibility tab, like in AoE 3, you can also now customize the color for each player, though in my experience that can be a little confusing in team games, as I remember very early on with AoE 3 DE changing all the colors and then saying stuff to my allies like, let's go attack red, and having my allies say, Spirit, you are red, and people's colors just not being in sync. So I learned quickly that sometimes less is more with color customization. There's no question graphically they put a lot of effort into details as well, with buildings blending into their terrain, incorporating the ground texture into the base of the building very organically. It's a nice touch that just makes things look natural. And also keep in mind they're not designing these things from scratch, but have to make them recognizable for veteran players that they're trying to win over. In terms of audio, outside of the controversial narration, a few people in my gameplay video comments mentioned the soundtrack had been redone. The unit voice lines sounded the same to me, and I'm pretty sure those are the originals, which is fair enough. It should be a nice nostalgia hit for the fans, and more background music for YouTubers. As for what can be improved, there's actually not that much I can point to. I think the collision size of villagers should probably be reduced a bit, as they can get stuck more often than even in AoE 2 woodlines, for example. There's also no flag when you set a rally point on a resource, so it's sometimes hard to know if you've actually set one, and on many occasions for one reason or another, I had villagers standing around that should have been working, though that might also be a skill issue on my end, if it's not a common complaint. There is a very long list of bugs being reported on the forums, and there's certainly no shortage of little things for them to work on. Though other than one crash and villagers acting a little buggy with pathing, it seems to be in good shape in my experience so far. There are weird things, like having to do a benchmark test before playing ranked every time you start the game, but I have a lot of faith that super obvious and easily fixed stuff like that is going to get worked out. Of course, if you're considering pre-ordering, it's important to note this is not a perfectly polished game yet. From an outside perspective, I'd also suggest that houses should maybe have 15 pop space instead of 10, just to make the mid-game battles feel a little bigger and more epic. But as far as I can tell, there really isn't a demand that pop limit needs to be increased in the community, and the devs would be wise to listen to veterans and not me on the topic. The overall impressions, I really enjoyed the early access, even more than I expected. I'm very confident this is going to become the de facto way to play the game, much like Definitive Edition was for AoE 2 and AoE 3, and I truly think it's going to go over well in the Age of Mythology community, which I know has been waiting a long time to get this. The fact the loudest criticism I've seen is around the voice acting in the campaigns, and generally art and UI design that you get used to almost immediately, tells me that the consensus is that the gameplay itself is solid. It's modern looking, seems intentionally designed to appeal to existing Age of Empires players from other games in the franchise, and with 2 confirmed DLCs already, looks to have some long-term plans for ongoing support. It's a fun game that's very fast-paced out of the gate, but then has 4 ages, plus an optional Titan and Wonder age you can reach for at the end that make it feel like you have a long runway tech-wise, with a useful wonder being an idea I think AoE 2 could borrow from. That'll do it for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.